Hello class, in this video I want to talk to you about Wangari Maathai. We are reading about Maathai, who was a Kenyan eco-feminist activist before she died in 2011. So a lot of her work was done in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in Kenya. And we are actually reading her as an example of feminist, of theological or spiritualized ecofeminism. And we're reading her next to Angelina Grimke, who presents us with a completely different way of being a feminist theological activist. So we're still thinking about how to connect your feminist commitments to your religious commitments, to a sort of activist advocacy stance. We saw that with Grimke, thinking about how she really appealed to women's own sense of themselves and their experiences in life to inspire them to help abolish slavery in the United States. And as we saw, Grimke appealed to the Bible, but also appealed to women's female power. And Wangari does something similar. And so I'm asking you, with looking at Wangari, to think about your feminist commitments, your religious commitments, but now adding in advocacy for nature and for ecology, and how that there's a form of activism that Wangari Maathai embodies that is deeply connected to feminist and especially womanist spirituality, womanist Christian spirituality. Maathai was born in 1940 in Kenya. She was, her parents, as you will read, were one of the first generation Christians in Kenya, and Maathai herself converted to Catholicism. So in this video, you might want to actually have your womanist idea reading in front of you, which is called Spiritualized Sustainability, Wangari Maathai, Unbowed, and the Green Belt Movement. That's the reading we're looking at this week, thinking about these, thinking about female feminist theological activism. So there's so much here. I don't know really how to organize it any better way than just to kind of go down, the points that are really important to me with Wangari. I guess I should call her by her last name because we do that with everybody, Maathai. She is a really good example of how you combine spirituality and activism with sort of a commitment to nature. And she's also a fabulous example of what we only talked about briefly in this class, which is womanism, and especially an African form of womanism. So we looked a little bit at Dolores Williams, who has a womanist perspective on the cross, rejecting the violence of sort of a white European understanding of the cross. And here with Maathai, we have an African womanism that really draws upon Christian spirituality, especially the biblical passages and the parts of the Christian tradition that connect the human to nature. So in Genesis, in the garden, but also that connects natural forces and things in nature to God's presence. So for Maathai, it was really clear that the trees in the forest around her village she talks about them being God's trees. And the Mount Kenya, I think? Mount Kenya was a natural sign assuring people in her area that God was present. So you have a very profound connection between Maathai's Christian spirituality and the way she reads the Bible with her commitment to nature and the natural world. And this is where you really see a great example of eco-spirituality, where she really defines herself as a person and tries to define all of humanity in terms of our connection to the natural world. And that's really what feminist eco-spirituality is all about. It's connecting your own being as a female, or in this case, this really is also like just as a male or a female, or anywhere in between, connecting your personhood to nature around you. And I actually want to jump to sort of something that she says at the very, very end of this chapter, which is that womanism is exactly about the survival and wholeness of the entire people, male and female and everything in between. And she says this is womanism. This is womanism. Actually, I think that's the editor's notes on Wangari, who passed away in 2011. But the reason why she's seen as a womanist is because she believed in using her female voice, and she refused to let, for example, her husband tell her and restrict her political activities. She refused to let sort of cultural expectations about women's place in Kenyan society restrict her activist activities. So she is a feminist in that she really keeps going. Maathai keeps going. She was in prison. She was in contempt of court. She ended up divorcing her husband, and that caused her a lot of problems because being a divorced woman in Kenya is not an easy thing. So she kept fighting these kinds of barriers, and that's what really gives her this sort of feminist sensibility, right? That she has, as a woman, a certain kind of moral power. And she is more womanist in that she uses her female moral power to fight for a larger swatch of people and beings than just, let's say, white women or black women, right? She is using her female moral power to help really save the environment around her for the sake of the flourishing of people. And that is finally the heart of womanism, is it's a person-centered movement and a person-centered advocacy spirituality. And I make a really strong point of that for you because I don't believe historically that white feminism has the same kind of holistic understanding of the interconnection of human beings, nor does it necessarily have the kind of deep spirituality that I think the womanist movement is trying to bring forward. And I say that because we live in a secular age, and it's just very interesting to me that womanists are capturing a sense of human spirituality that includes Christian spirituality, Muslim spirituality, Jewish spirituality, pagan spirituality, but this sense, this deep desire for humanity to be connected to both one another and to nature. And that's something that womanism really focuses on in a way that I'm not sure white feminism does. And, you know, it's not necessarily a criticism of white feminism, but it's trying to give you this kind of distinction between feminism and womanism. I don't want you to see feminism and womanism only as sort of a quote-unquote black or white person's distinction. I think white women can be womanists, but you have to understand, as if you want to be a womanist white person, that you have to kind of shift your priorities a little bit and really help move out of just sort of fighting against the glass ceiling or something like that, right? So Maathai was the first woman in Kenya to earn a PhD, and then she got involved in her husband's business of planting trees, and the business failed, but she continued to have this community tree planting situation where she helped people learn about trees, plant trees, and it turned into this really important moral, ethical movement. And if you look at some of the documentaries of her or of her talking on YouTube, you'll find that she's very conscious, based on her experiences, of the fact that people in power do one thing, and it is they do whatever they can to benefit themselves in power. And Maathai was very conscious of that, and therefore sort of saw her advocacy as pushing against people in power. And as she says, at that time, the Kenyan government was sponsoring the state destruction of the forests in her area of Kenya. And so she sees this, she talks about this a lot as the way that sort of a capitalistic understanding of nature commodifies all of nature. And I make a point of that because it brings us back to the very first week of talking about feminism today, which is that feminism itself has also been commodified, and that the capitalist mentality has altered the feminist movement. And womanism, I think, is also trying to fight against this sort of capitalist push to commodify every moral stance, right? So you take a stance on women, and then you get to buy a t-shirt on how you're taking a stance on women, right? Or the government sees these beautiful trees, and rather than seeing them as something sacred or something that actually helps human flourishing just by being there, and actually maybe has a scientific reason for human flourishing, i.e. sucking up carbon dioxide, oxygenating the world, bringing stability to soil, bringing animals and water to areas, things like that. Capitalist mentality has said, okay, we can actually help people flourish by commodifying this natural resource. And if we give people cash, right, that is going to actually help their lives flourish. And what I want you to see is that womanist spirituality and this sort of womanist eco-spirituality of Maathai is really pushing against a capitalist mentality. Now, I myself am not against a capitalist society. I totally benefit from a capitalist society. But is it that we're living in an era of unbridled capitalism, where there's this sense that the quote-unquote invisible hand of the market is going to help, or that globalization is going to lift all boats, when in fact, I think Maathai's prophetic voice is saying, well, those people in power who are using that rhetoric are actually, in fact, on the other hand and behind the scenes, being extremely destructive of people's communities and of nature for their own benefit. Right? So capitalism can be a wonderful thing for everybody, or it can be the best thing for a few and the absolute worst thing for the many. And I think that's what we're kind of experiencing today and becoming aware of, is that while capitalism can be an amazing force, Maathai's example really shows that it also it can be a completely destructive force, and it very often is. Especially because there's nothing sacred in a capitalist society except money. Okay, there's nothing sacred. There is no sacred tree. There is no sacred mountain. There is no sacred space. And that's the piece where I want you to really think about how a feminist eco-spirituality needs to really start advocating for the earth. And unfortunately, the messages that come through today are that we should save the earth because it's the only way humanity is going to survive. And it's sad that we can no longer make arguments that we should save the earth or certain environments because they are sacred. Because when we let parts of our environment die or be destroyed, we're letting God's body, God's face, God's hands be destroyed as well. That we are losing sight of God, who is so in our faces in nature that we just can't see him or her, right? And so that's, I think, the piece about Maathai's eco-spirituality that is really important for us to learn. One thing that she says that I think is absolutely critical for all of us is on page 269, where she talks a lot about activism being something that could really and truly be, she says, a single local idea. Plant trees in your neighborhood. Do something in your neighborhood with a small number of people who surround you. And she talks about in one of her videos of how if everybody did that small thing, if everybody plants a few trees, if every community works together to find how they're interconnected, that's when you start having mass movements. And I think that's a very helpful way to think about where we are in today's world and how activism doesn't have to be a gigantic movement. Hopefully it could become that with your own activism, but that your own spirituality can start very small and very local. And again, what Maathai shows us is that it draws upon a certain understanding of the woman's moral power. And I don't want to essentialize women or females, but what I do want to say is men as well. Men, you have a moral power as well. You are moral agents. And how is it that we can draw upon ourselves as moral agents in being religious activists? So the final thing I want to say goes back to womanism and what Maathai says on page 274, where she basically talks about womanism having an irreverent but hospitable spirit. And that is what I really love about womanism, is to be irreverent and hospitable. And I do fear that white women are captured in a certain kind of spirituality or cultural environment where it's very difficult for us to be seen as irreverent, because our power as white women is really very much tied up with the power of white men in our lives. And I think womanists are more free from that, and that gives this movement a different kind of characteristic than white feminism has. Good. So class, I think I've said enough. I hope I've introduced you a little bit to Maathai and to see that she's a wonderful example of a feminist Christian eco-spirituality. And I look forward to your comments. And I also look forward to your own ways of thinking about yourselves being irreverent, hospitable activists that really and truly can feel good about starting small and starting local, and what that might look like as an act of the Christian faith. Thanks for your attention.